time, the owners were all vested in title at the same exact time. If you had a joint tenancy and one of the owners, let's say you're three owners, one of the owners sold their third share to someone else, what would happen is that the original two tenants or the original two owners still own their interest as a joint tenants. So what happens there, if owner A or owner B died, the other one would get their shares. But owner D, the new guy that just came on the block, he bought his share from owner C. He came into title at a different time. So in regards to his 1/3 share interest, he is that's right, tenant in common. So if he dies, his third interest goes to his heirs. A or B die, well, the other one gets their interest. Kind of an interesting mix of how things happen there, but great test material, and also things you need to understand when you're out practically doing the business. Now, if you had an A, B, and D situation, how many signatures would you need on the listing? A's, B's, and D's. All owners must sign the listing contract, and all owners must sign the sales agreement. And if one owner is not available, well, then you're going to have to use some sort of electronic means of transferring to that person to get their signature, or you could go with the power of attorney. But all this needs to be worked out in advance before you get those offers in on the property. Sometimes you need to prepare properly so that the property is marketable and it's ready to go. There's another kind of ownership used in just a few states in the U.S., and that's called community property. These are states that primarily had either French or Spanish origins, like California, for example, is a community property state. So is Idaho, our neighbor to the north. But Utah is not a community property state. Whoever is vested in title in Utah is the owner of that property. But community property states, either there's some peculiarities to it, but they're following Spanish or French traditions, like Louisiana, Texas, which was Mexico at one time. Those are all community property states. Not so important that you have to recognize which states are community property and which states are not. Just understand that Utah is not. But it is important to have just a basic feeling that in a community property state, you could have separate or you could have joint property. The rules of having separate property are perhaps you owned it before you got married, or perhaps you acquired it with the sale of the proceeds from a sale of another property that was separate and you bought another separate property. But you have to keep meticulous records to prove what is community and what is not, because in a community property state, if one spouse's name is on the title, it doesn't mean they own it in severalty. It doesn't mean that they own it alone. In a community property state, even though one spouse's name is on the title, it could very well be, if that property was treated like community property, that it's owned by both. So kind of an interesting situation there. It comes up once in a while in your practice where you have owners that live in Idaho, Arizona, or perhaps California, and they own property here. And they are used to, because they've been told by their attorneys in California, that both parties have to sign all the agreements. But you've listed a property here in Utah that only belonged to perhaps the wife. Maybe it was her parents' home that she inherited when they both died. Been renting it out for a while, and now they've decided to sell it and list it with you. Well, that's fine, but whose signature do you need on the listing contract? Well, Utah is not a community property state. We go by something called situs here, S-I-T-U-S, which means that where the property is located, those state laws apply. Well, she lives in California, it's true, but her property's here in Utah. You only need her signature on the contracts. And when that property closes, her proceeds check will be made out in her name only. Now, her spouse in California might say, oh, no, you can't do it that way. We both have to sign, and that needs to be paid to both of us, and my attorney said so. Well, yeah, in regards to California property, but not Utah property. When partners don't see eye to eye, then there could be a situation where they have to part ways, and that could be a partition action. I mean, one of the most common partition actions is divorce, where a couple has decided not to be together any longer, and so the judge is going to decide what's going to happen with that property, or at least they're going to ratify what the owners decided to do. If they can't decide, then the judge will decide. But That's a partition action. But a divorce is not the only one. It could be that 3 partners or 4 partners can't get along and they disagree, and so they appeal to the court to decide what's going to happen with their property. Typically, the judges order these properties sold and then the proceeds divided amongst the owners. But that's called a partition action. Another way of owning property in Utah is in severalty, but not with a breather, a flesh and bones individual, but a non-breather, an entity. Non-breathers could be like corporations, limited partnerships, LLCs, and the like. I call them non-breathers because they are a legal person, not a natural person. And so what happens is a corporation can own a property in their own name, or they could own a property with someone else. Now, obviously, you cannot own a property as a joint tenant if you're a non-breather. For example, a corporation cannot own 50% and then have a flesh and bones individual own the other 50% as joint tenants. Why? Well, it's unfair. Corporation never dies. LLC never dies. As long as you keep renewing your charter, they will last forever. So eventually they'll outlive the breather. They'll outlive the flesh and bones individual. And because of what? Yeah, that's right. The right of survivorship, then the corporation would eventually acquire total ownership. Unfair. So any entity, any legal person cannot own property as a joint tenant. Therefore, the only other type of common ownership or multiple ownership available to them is tenants in common.